So the live stream is now live for anybody joining us. Let's see. All right, there we go. The live stream is active. We are recording. Welcome, everyone. This is our fourth lesson in the current Conchas y Café series. And tonight we're going to be talking about something that I think we all do in a lot of different ways in all sorts of languages. But as usual, to get us started, I want to first share my screen here with you and discuss this quote that I found actually just today. It comes from Larkin Rose, an American writer who's also an outspoken advocate of the principles of self-ownership, non-aggression, and a stateless society. Para los que nos están acompañando y prefieren en español, aquí tienen también en la pantalla la traducción de la cita de hoy, que dice: la política, el arte de usar eufemismos, mentiras, sentimentalismo y el alarmismo para engañar a la gente para que acepten o hasta demanden su propia esclavitud. And in English, it says, politics, the art of using euphemisms, lies, emotionalism, and fear-mongering to dupe average people into accepting or even demanding their own enslavement. So aquí se los voy a copiar. Drop it in our chat as well. So what are your thoughts as you read the quote of the day? ¿Qué se imaginan que pensaba Larkin Rose al escribir lo que acabamos de leer?
The statement that you made, I believe it's very true. It's true today. It was true a long time ago, that an environment of constant practice and structures and behaviors can be, well, not behaviors, it involves behaviors, but just a common structure of things going a certain way, it increases your beliefs, and you don't take it any other way, you know. I can't find the right words, because I when I was going to church as a little girl, we were told not to go with your legs bare, your arms bare, and have something on your head, you know, maybe a scarf or a hat or something. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of being a slave to certain standards. And then it was told to me that books were kept from certain groups of people, and that they were taught what the people in power wanted them to have as a standard of life, a belief, and they became slaves to it. And we today do the same thing. I hope I made myself clear. Yeah.
Yeah. I understood. I followed what you were saying. You know, I think it's an interesting connection to make between like a religious practice or an observance that is of a religious nature, you know, to what we're seeing here. So yeah, thank you for sharing, Ms. Lois. Yeah. I saw Abraham's hand first and then Gia. So Abraham.
Well, it's kind of the old story of how we're being manipulated by either party, if we can call them parties, because sometimes it seems like they're working for the same goals. And reminded me of how the Japanese were encamped. You know, it's a certain population that was being told that their rights were not longer provided, because whatever reason the government used the words, right? Like just to say that you are different, but without saying we're gonna just take your rights away, probably, right?
Yeah, that's I mean, you know, one way to see how that happens, for sure. Gia?
Yeah, I was thinking that there's even a more recent example because you have like Fox News talking about wokeism and, you know, how horrible wokeism is. And, you know, just like they've created this euphemism for anything that they don't believe, because like what is wrong with education and books and all the things that, you know, there, or inclusiveness, you know, all the things that they're contributing to wokeism. So that's the euphemism and that's the buzzword they're using right now.
Right. And then I like that you brought up the concept of a buzzword. You know, it's a word that is kind of like a almost like a trigger, you know, for some people. It's the word that's created or used to act as like a marker for something else, for an idea, for whatever the case might be. Yeah. In the chat, I see Nettie posted disenchanted after seeing politics with peeled eyes. Maybe that's like, Nettie, you could maybe clarify a little bit, but I'm imagining that that's what you think the writer of this was thinking when they wrote it. Sí o no?
Well, we are conditioned to either favor one end of the spectrum or the other, and that's also shaped by our life circumstances and life experiences. I mean, if you ask each one of us based on our life experiences, we probably vote different, right? That being said, I think that you kind of get in love with ideology just only to figure out that ideology has just broken your heart. It doesn't stand for its own principles. And this could be applied for both sides. So that's what I mean by disenchanted. That's what I mean that by seeing things with peeled eyes. You didn't want to see, but you were forced to see. That's why I say peeled eyes.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Okay, in the statement up there, it says politics, but today, or at least my understanding, people think politics is the government, but politics is just a manipulation standard that engulfs people. You know, politics is being on the bandwagon. Yeah, wagging your tail to manipulate people into believing what you want them to believe. That's what politics is. It's like a science of verbal science. You know, what do you call? They used to call that. When you get into people's mind, what would they used to call that? Oh man, I can't even think of it. But it's a manipulation. Beg your pardon? Yeah, it's just,
yeah, manipulation, right?
yeah, it's just a manipulation. Politics is a style of manipulation. That's, you know, politics, you know, it's like making me believe what you want me to believe by the way that you we used to have this in our critical speaking class. I can't even think of the thing. Oh, but anyway, that's all it is. Politics is just a standard, to me, a standard of to motivate people. It's not a standard. I can't think of the word. It's a manipulation. Politics is just a style of getting people to believe what you want them to believe. I can't even think of the word. Oh my goodness. Go ahead. Oh man, what is that word?
Brainwashing?
Propaganda?
Well, that too, but mental, it's not mental, but telepathy. What is it? Anyway, I can't think.
Well, I think if I'm understanding, generally speaking, what you're talking about, it sounds like what you're referring to is how politics are used as a way to both manipulate and, in some ways, as some people have said, brainwash us, the people, into thinking certain ways or
Yes.
using certain language, you know, in the case of like the concept of wokeism and how as an ism, it's now bad or somehow it stands for something that, you know, is something to fear or to maybe judge in a way that's negative.
Yes. All of that. All of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. And, you know, I think it's also good to sort of be critical to a certain degree of the author that wrote this, right? Of the person attributed to this. Right? He's an outspoken advocate of the principles of self-ownership, non-aggression, and a stateless society, meaning a society that is free of government, right? Or at least of politics. So this is coming from one viewpoint where, you know, he's himself using language and certain words that are meant to evoke certain feelings from us to express an idea of his without directly saying, you know, what he probably would want to say. Let's see, in the chat, I see Miss Michelle wrote, "It's Big Brother by George Orwell too, because people may follow the crowd and be influenced." Right. I think Gia's example of the way in which Fox News manipulates information or presents information, you know, that could be a way to see how in real life now, in contemporary society, you know, we see people sort of following along without doing more research, without maybe accepting that there are other truths out there than the one that's presented to them first. See, looking at the chat here. Okay, thank you, Elena, for the heads up. And then Miss Michelle wrote again, Trump's January 6th, 2022 at the Capitol may be an example because he led others to follow him and his views. Yeah, you know, that as a pseudo politician, because I don't think people anywhere would, you know, necessarily believe that he was a real politician in the way that everyone is used to. But, you know, yeah, him and the way that he spoke, his use of certain words, you know, they were definitely ways in which he gained followers and manipulated their actions to a certain degree. I think it's interesting too to look at this quote and think about, you know, what it says. You know, if we break down the elements of how Larkin Rose is defining politics, you know, la política es el arte de usar eufemismos, mentiras, sentimentalismo, y el alarmismo. Right? Politics is the art of using euphemisms, lies, emotionalism, and fear-mongering. If we were to look at each one individually by themselves, you know, we could definitely gain a sense of what there is being said and what is not being said. You know, euphemisms themselves are a way for us to sort of make things a little bit easier to digest, you know. And in the sense of politics, you know, that might be the case, right? We can probably go back hundreds of years and look at the ways in which people talk about the concept of equality and community, or the things in which we're supposed to be afraid of, like, you know, the way in which in the 90s, there were the criminalization of certain groups was being presented, you know, by even more liberal politicians. You know, those are all different things that we can see that are reflected in what Larkin Rose is saying. But, you know, what happens if that's used maybe in another sense too? Or maybe the other question is, you know, what does it really mean to use things like euphemisms? And, you know, maybe just focusing on that for today. That's why I actually present to you a second quote. And this quote comes from Matthew Scully, who was born March 30th, 1959. He's also an American author, journalist, and political writer who is also very much about animal welfare, and he's written a lot about that. Y aquí Matthew Scully, para la segunda cita, nos dice: cuando nos hacemos pequeños al ver algo, cuando lo cubrimos con el eufemismo, típicamente es señal de conflicto interno, de corazones molestos, un señal de que algo se nos fue mal en nuestro razonamiento moral. And in English, he wrote, when we shrink from the sight of something, when we shroud it in euphemism, that is usually a sign of inner conflict, of unsettled hearts, a sign that something has gone wrong in our moral reasoning. So, looking at this particular quote, now what does this make you think in relation to the other one? What do you get out of this quote? Gia?
Yeah, this makes me think more about like how society deals with death. And so there always seems like there's a lot of euphemisms attached to death because so many people are uncomfortable with the subject, especially in this country. So, you know, it's like they went to the light, you know, everything has as opposed to actually saying the word. So this one makes me think more of that type of euphemism.
Okay, interesting. Nettie?
I think that if we're using euphemisms or we're sugarcoating a message, probably there might be more sinister and deeper motivation behind the message, like a whistleblower. What's the word? I think I messed that up. Dog whistle. That's the word. Dog whistle.
Well, like, I mean, a dog whistle is normally used as a term for, at least now, to say that you're speaking to a particular group of people with a particular ideology, and you're expecting them to react, right? So in some ways, that's what Larkin Rose is talking about, right? That's the way in which politics, especially right now, is working. You know, there's certain euphemisms that are being used, especially for more conservative ideologies, to stand in the place of something that might be more difficult to talk about. So what does that mean, though, right? If there's a thing that is difficult to talk about and we're using euphemism, well, according to Matthew Scully, you know, it's a sign of inner conflict. It's a sign of unsettled hearts, a sign that something has gone wrong in our moral reasoning. All right. One thing that you might have heard of, or maybe not, but there's a phrase, and I might get it wrong because I don't really remember the phrase too clearly, but it's something along the lines of like, let's go Brandon, right? And that's a euphemism that came out, I think last year during NASCAR races. And it's because the crowd was chanting, fuck Biden. But the announcers, the sportscasters on TV obviously couldn't acknowledge it by directly saying what that was that the crowd was chanting. So they claimed that people were saying, let's go Brandon. And then that ended up becoming a euphemism that is currently being used to basically talk poorly about the president, about Joe Biden, right? So does that kind of make sense to people? How, you know, there's potentially an inner conflict there? Can we think of other examples of where, you know, euphemism comes into play aside from the way that people talk about death in society?
So you're saying that that is a replacement?
Yeah, that's right. It's a type of replacement, for sure.
But what I got from the two of them to link them to me together, I know he's supposed to tell the difference, but I see fear in both of them.
Interesting. That's a good observation, Ms. Lois. Gia?
Yeah, make America great again is a euphemism to, you know, going back to a time when it was just great for a certain section of people. So it's, you know, it makes it seem like, oh, you're patriotic, but there's this undertone to it.
Mhm.
Perfect, perfect.
Yeah, that's a good example for sure. Any other examples that people could think of off the top of their head? And they don't necessarily all have to be, for like conservative ideologies. But think about this though. Why would people, especially in talking about conservative ideologies, why would they feel the need to use euphemisms? If what Matthew Scully is saying, then what is really happening? If what he is saying is true, what is really happening to the people that are using these euphemisms? Roots, I see your hand was raised.
What came to mind was the war on drugs.
Hmm. And in
I
what
feel
way?
well, I feel like they use that like to make us think like they're protecting us, they're cleaning up crime and all this stuff, when it's really like a war on poor communities, which are predominantly Black and brown.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then like even
Mhm.
to connect it with the politics is the art, the first one that Larkin Rose wrote, I think that, if we go back to the Ronald Reagan era and how, they were funding the wars and, with drugs that they were dropping off in LA,
Mhm.
so like, yeah, you could see how they're playing both sides of the, trying to be the heroes, but they're always also the supervillains.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. I mean, go ahead, Miss Lois. You had something more
I
to
was
add?
going to say, yeah, she mentioned drugs, and that reminds me of when they first started selling marijuana at on every street corner with these little crosses out. And I grew up around it. I had pimps in my family. I had pushers in my family. But I just believe whatever you're going to do, don't push it off on someone else. Enjoy it yourself, do it in your house or whatever. And
Mhm.
so when they started, they had it. I don't remember exactly when it started or how it started, but it was out there. And then they started saying it was for medicine, and that you could be 25 years old or a little older to get it.
Mhm.
No problems. And I think that had a lot to do with it says when we shrink from the sight of something, when we shroud it, is that the word shroud?
Yes.
In other words, cover it up.
Mhm.
That it is usually a sign of inner conflict. My granddaughter, she's grown now, and she was selling it, and I don't know, she probably was using it, I don't know, but I was wondering how could she do that to the younger children, and the younger children would take it to the schoolyards,
Mhm.
it just didn't seem right. So the inner conflict probably was there in her midst. That is usually a sign of inner conflict, of
Mhm.
unsettled, because she says, Granny, I've got to make some money somehow. And so it's unsettled with his hearts, a sign of something has gone wrong in our moral reasoning. So, maybe his mother needed it. I mean, a lot of excuses you got, maybe they need it, just a whole bunch of excuses. So something went wrong. Something is wrong with that. I
Yeah.
remember a long time ago when I was a kid, on the voting days, the liquor store would close until voting time was over. But now you
Good.
go in, buy 2, 3, or 4 bottles.
Hmm.
So something's gone wrong with our moral reasoning, our standards of proper protocol.
protocols. Yeah, yeah. I just, I think that it was to me it was interesting, looking at these two quotes and trying to sort of understand what both of them were saying in preparation for today's lesson. And politics, everyone has a certain identity when it comes to politics, the same as with like religion. And those things are oftentimes difficult to discuss. And one of the things that I have in my limited experience found is that regardless of what side you're on in terms of your political ideological leanings, whether you're, more liberal or more conservative, I feel like everyone generally agrees with the idea that politics does use lying, does use escapism, emotionalism, fear mongering, all of the things that are presented there to make people feel like one side is greater than the other. And that's something that is something that I feel like a person could step back, take a moment and look at. And when we think about the way in which we use language, we can also consider that those are some of the things that we do even every day in our language, which, euphemisms is definitely one of the ways in which we approach language on a daily basis, whether we think about it or not. But before we continue on, Ms. Michelle, see you raised your hand.
With all these quotes, I feel like the saying that goes like this: the more things change, the more they stay the same. That's what I'm equating to regarding these quotes, because we want change to happen and change, and yet it doesn't happen with politics. In regards to how people vote, their influence for a certain reason. Like, let's say, for instance, George Gascon, who's a district attorney from the city of Los Angeles. Many people voted for him. They didn't vote for Jackie Lacey, who's been here for 20 years as a DA. And the first thing he said was, I'm not going to go for the death penalty. So people want him recalled. And yet it's not happening. And the reason why I say that as an example is because people voted for him at face value based on what they saw. But that's how that's how the politicians act. They maybe people consider him a hypocrite versus what he really represented. Because I know people who voted for him, and yet people are not happy with what happened. But then again, if it wasn't for Jackie Lacey's husband, and when he attacked people at his house who were bothering him in his home, people from Black Lives Matter, not to put that into it, but he was attacked or trespassers were there, and that was the view for voting for Gascon. And now, boom, Gascon's doing the opposite. So therefore, the recall seems to be at a standstill, and that to me is an example of how politics can be twisted or disappointment, and then, oh gosh, that's not what I voted for. I voted for him. Or gee, that's not what I wanted. Surprise. And yet it happens all the time. And then I also mentioned in the chat about the drug infiltration and how it could be genocide and an enterprise in regards to how drugs influence and infiltrate. And I mentioned the movie American Gangster with Denzel Washington and Russell Crowe, because Miss Lois had mentioned about drugs infiltrating and her, with her family and how that in that aspect of things. But seeing that and seeing the movies about blaxploitation in the 70s brought that to a forefront in regards to how the drugs infiltrate. And even though that's in the 70s, in certain parts of this nation in the 70s it happened. I mean, Shaft, Superfly, those kind of movies. And even though it's still, this is 50 plus years later, this is still 2023, and drugs still infiltrate. Who feels it? The gangs. People come from over the world, the jail systems bring the drugs in on the street. You have to pay certain people to be on the street to own a shop, or else by the gang members and everything else, or else you have nothing. And that's what drugs also infiltrate in regards to being an enterprise as well as genocide. Because people still get killed and hurt due to drugs infiltrating. And I mentioned that point because it was mentioned earlier by what Ms. Lois said earlier.
Mhm.
So it makes you wonder about politics can be a dirty word. Hence, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah, that particular phrase I think is a very interesting phrase to consider when we look at history and even the way in which some of these things kind of come and go in terms of the way we use our language. You know, like I said earlier, really looking at these two quotes that are, you know, up on our screen right now, you know, one of the things that they have in common is the concept of euphemisms, right?
Right.
And the use of euphemisms. In politics, you know, we would probably use them, like I was saying earlier, to have a sort of coded language, right? A language that acts as a whistleblower's language or a dog whistle, you know, for certain groups of certain political parties, right? Like I said earlier, if you walk around saying something like "Let's go, Brandon," you know, and you're surrounded by people who are conservative, they're probably going to understand that that is coded language for "fuck Biden," you know. But at the same time, you could also go around using other forms of coded language, other forms of euphemisms in a more neutral setting to maybe shy away from talking about something that is maybe difficult to talk about in other areas, like someone's dying, right? We don't say they died. We normally would say they passed away, they went to the light, as Gia said earlier. You know, we have all these little phrases, all of these little you know, codes that we use instead of speaking directly. So you know, there's definitely ways in which euphemisms are used both in politics and in everyday life. But what I really find interesting, mostly from the second quote, is that it it's a sign of inner conflict, right? And especially because we're in a society where right now it's very, you know, polarized, right? There are people who are advocating for essentially civil war between within the United States. You know, all of us who are people of color, anybody that is different from a Christian nationalist, you know, we're all sort of viewed as this kind of enemy that is just waiting to overtake an ideology that is just not the majority ideology, you know, of even kind of your everyday conservative person. It's like this very radicalized group that is villainizing everyone else. And it makes me wonder, like, what is their inner conflict that they feel the need to constantly use euphemisms, to use wokeism as a euphemism for a specific kind of person? You know, what is it that they're experiencing? And I would really like to understand that, because the more we're able to understand that, I think the more we're able to move past it and hopefully bring people together. So, but that's what I'm kind of getting from looking at these quotes today. And you know, to maybe help the conversation, I also provide here the definition of euphemism. But before that, Abraham.
Well, just to notice that, like, yeah, there's two different topics in a sense in these two quotes, because the other one has three different ways, right, in which basically people try to mobilize or get people on their side by depicting something with words, right? Because words have so much strength. Like, for example, the word that I find all the time is interesting is like, you're being detained instead of being arrested.
Yeah.
Because being arrested meaning you are not free to go. Detained, you supposedly are free to go, right? And so the second one we're talking about, it's more specific in the euphemism and how, well, it's not as used in like sense of I think they're trying to make it seem like it's a more nice way into will. Each person is trying to lower their, what's it called, their guilt, by clearing their conscience by using softer words. Like, instead of "I took a bribe," it's like, "I just got a raise," kind of situation.
Yeah.
And so it's a way of us making a reality a little softer. You know, if we made especially a wrong action, we may want to clear our conscience by using a word that's telling us that it wasn't that bad.
Mhm. Yeah, and like that's even I think something that we find in like I was saying earlier, our everyday language, sure, in politics it's just that much more amplified where it's used, it's weaponized, but in our everyday language we also use it. And to say that, like, oh, tengo que dar la mordida, if you get stopped by a cop, like you're saying, you have to pay a bribe, but at the same time, you're doing it in kind of a way that's also coded language, but maybe not as polarizing in a sense, because it's something that you just sort of accept as part of your everyday life. Yeah, that's another good one that Abraham just provided, right? I'm curvy instead of saying I'm fat, or there's so many other ways, right, in which this comes up.
That reminds me, we used to tell this girl, no, that she was fat. She says, no, I'm juiciously plump.
Well, yeah, there's definitely ways in which we address things, that make us uncomfortable, right? Or fluffy instead of fat. Yeah, that's another way of putting it. That's been popularized.
Fluffy.
But it's also good, I think, for us to just generally understand, what is the purpose of a euphemism? We also can't understand a euphemism without understanding its opposite too, right? But here is the actual definition of euphemism and its actual opposite, the dysphemism. Euphemism is a mild or indirect word or expression substituted for one considered to be too harsh or blunt when referring to something unpleasant or embarrassing. Y en español, el eufemismo, igual. Una palabra o un dicho suave o indirecto, sustituyendo uno considerado muy áspero o directo, al referirse a algo desagradable o penoso. So, rather than calling someone fat, which, to be honest with you, when I was a little boy, it hurt to be called fat, especially by my grandma in Mexico, who was just a very direct person, But, as a kid up here, it was like, oh, he's just a little chubby, a little, tiene su llantita, and that did not hurt as much, even though it's still acknowledging the same fact. I was fat, right? The dysphemism, I mean, you could think of it as like a disrespectful thing to say, right? It is a derogatory or unpleasant term used instead of a pleasant or neutral one, such as loony bin for mental hospital, right? That's one that you've most likely have heard at some point in your life. Disfemismo, en español, es el opuesto del eufemismo. Es un término o dicho derogatorio y o desagradable usado en lugar de uno agradable o neutral, tal como casa de locos en lugar de manicomio o hospital psiquiátrico, right? So these are words that we will use every day without even realizing it, to sort of either make someone feel good or make someone feel really shitty about themselves. Those are essentially the functions of both of these terms, the euphemism and the dysphemism. I think what's really important to also consider here is that every single word that we use has a connotation, right? A connotation, which I didn't list here in terms of the definition, but the connotation is an implied meaning. It's a meaning that comes from just understanding the culture of a language, that comes from, just the tone and the usage of particular words in the place of others, right? The annotation is literal definition, right? Euphemism, the annotation of euphemism is a mild or indirect word or expression, right? Whereas the connotation of a euphemism is that it's a kind word, it's a gentler word. Notice the different ways in which I'm describing the same exact word, right? So that's, I think, really, really important for us to consider when, especially we're writing, and really even more so for us that are poets, because we live and breathe by the word. You know, the words that we choose are very deliberate. No matter what kind of writer you are, your words always have to be precise, to the point, to whatever the meaning of the piece is for you and your audience. So a euphemism, if you're going to use a euphemism in your writing, it really has to stand on its own in terms of the way the connotations function within the writing, and also as a metaphor, because a metaphor is just another way of saying a word that is taking the place of another word or concept. Does anyone have any questions so far? No? All right. Entonces vamos a seguir. Y aquí tengo para ustedes un poema que encontré de este autor, poeta norteamericano llamado Bob Hickok. And this particular poem for today comes from his book Insomnia Diary, which came out in 2004. And it just so happens to be called Dropping the Euphemism. Do I have a volunteer that would like to read it for us? Oh, I saw a hand. Diana? Would you like to read it for us today?
Yes.
All right.
Should I read the Spanish or the English?
Whichever one you prefer.
Okay, let's do the English. Okay, Dropping the Euphemism by Bob Hickok from the Insomnia Diary 2004. He has 5 children. I'm Papa to 100 pencils. I bought the chair he sat in. From a book of chairs, staplers, and spikes that let me play Vlad, the Impaler. With invading memos, when I said, I have to lay you off, a parallel universe was born. In his face, one where flesh is a loose shirt, taken to the river and beaten against rocks. Just by opening my mouth, I destroyed his faith. He's a man who can think honey glazed ham and act out the thought with plastic or bills. We sat. I stared at my hands. He stared at the wall, staring at my hands. I said other things about the excellent work he'd done and the cycles of business, which are like the roller coaster thoughts of an oscilloscope. All this time I saw the eyes of his wife, which had always been brown like almonds, but were now brown like the crust of bread. We walked to the door. I shook his hand, felt the bones pretending to be strong. On his way home, there was a happy song because Desade invented radio. The window was open. He saw Delphinium, but couldn't remember the name. I could only guess, maybe at each exit, that could have led his body to Mars. He was tempted to forget his basketball team of sons, or that he ever liked helping his wife clean carrots, the silver sink turning orange. Running's natural to most animals who aren't part of a lecture series on natures. That ends when I told him. I saw he was looking for a place in his brain to hide. His brain. I tried that later with beer. It worked until I stood at the toilet to make my little waterfall. And I thought of him pushing back from a bar to go make the same noise.
Excellent. Thank you, Diana.
Yes.
Very good reading. All right. And en español hay un voluntario que gusta leer el poema. Let's see. I think first hand I saw was from Maria.
Ok, dejando el eufemismo. Él tiene 5 hijos. Yo soy papá de cientos de lápices. Compra la silla en el que se sentaba, de un libro de sillas engrapadoras y puntas que me dejan jugar a Vlad el empalador con memos invasores. Cuando le dije, te tengo que despedir, un universo paralelo nació en su cara, uno donde la piel es una camisa floja llevada al río y golpeada contra piedras. Con solo el abrir de mi boca destruí su confianza de ser hombre que puede pensar en jamón glaseado en miel y vivir tal pensamiento con plástico o billetes sentábamos. Yo miraba mis manos, él miraba a la pared mirando a mis manos. Le dije otras cosas sobre el trabajo excelente que había hecho y los ciclos del negocio que son como la montaña rusa de pensamientos de un osciloscopio todo el rato. Vi los ojos de su esposa, cuales siempre fueron café, como almendras, pero hoy fueron café, como corteza de pan. Caminamos. A la puerta le di mi mano, sentí sus huesos fingiendo ser fuertes en camino a su casa. Tocaba una canción alegre porque Sade inventó la radio. La ventana estaba abierta. Él vio espuelas de caballero, pero no recordaba su nombre. Solo me lo imaginó. Quizá en cada salida que pudo llevar en su cuerpo a Tempe o Marte estuvo tentando a olvidar su equipo de baloncesto, de hijos o que le gustaba ayudar a su esposa a pelar zanahorias, la pila plateada volviéndose anaranjada. El huir es natural para la mayoría de animales, cuales no son parte de una serie de charlas sobre los callejones sin salida de la naturaleza. Cuando le dije, vi que buscaba a un lugar en su mente para esconder a su mente. Yo lo intenté después, con cerveza, trabajo hasta que me paré frente al inodoro a hacer mi cascadita y pensé en él, retirándose de una barra para ir a hacer el mismo ruido.
All right. Thank you, Maria. Good job. Let's go back up to the top here. And there we go. So aquí tienen Cropping the Euphemism by Bob Hickok. So first things first, you've heard it twice now, and I want to make sure that everybody knows generally the story, right? The narrative. What happened in this poem?
Too much happened for me.
Too much happened?
I was hoping that instead of has would be had, a past tense, and the pencils were well, how do you pronounce that? Yeah, that. No, the replacement for the children, the 5 pencils.
Ah.
Yeah. And then I bought the chairs he sat in. So at first I thought it was I'm Papa and to 100 pencils.
Mhm.
So he must have been a teacher and he only had 5 children.
Yeah, I mean, something along the lines of that. So yeah, you're sort of getting there, Ms. Lois.
Yeah, so I would have to read this and contemplate.
Okay. Yeah, it is a slightly longer one, and this does have a story to it. So that's where first I want to make sure that we're all kind of following along. I see that Abraham was a little confused as well in the chat. And Miss Luz actually got the story generally, complete. It's a boss that is feeling remorse for firing an employee.
Oh, my goodness gracious.
Yeah, so there's, yeah. So, if you got that from the story, then obviously there were euphemisms and, metaphors and connotations that you generally understood. If you didn't get it the first time, that's okay. Either way, I was going to read it for all of us a little bit.
We
A
don't
little
want
bit
it
more,
hard.
so one more time so we could get it. But before we move on, I see hands up still from Paola and Diana. Paola, did you have a question or comentario?
Oh, I see that now. When I said I have to lay you off, a parallel universe was born.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness gracious.
Mhm. Ok, oh, gracias, Paola. Yeah. Me imaginaba que eso era, pero. Do you have a comment, though, or a question? También se vale. Or Diana, you left your hands up as well. Comment or question? Okay, I guess not.
Yeah, I was just sorry. I was
Okay.
just it was a little confusing. I was trying to like understand what he was kind of talking about. I was
Mhm.
taking it as a loss, like like
Mhm.
as a loss until when you called out that I had to lay you off. I was completely like in a whole different scenario.
Yeah, like I said, this has a lot of things happening within it. So, I just want to be clear, right? There's a narrative to it too. And but I'm glad that particular line was called out, because yes, this is a poem about a boss that has to lay off someone, right? They have to fire one of their employees. And it's, what the boss is imagining the employee is going through after being told that they're being fired. But notice the euphemisms, right? And the irony of the poem title dropping the euphemism. So I'll read it for us one more time, this time without the dramatic pauses of the line breaks. And I'm going to try and just read it all the way through so we can sort of hear it a little bit more. So we can hear a little more, I guess, the narrative. So dropping the euphemism. He has 5 children. I'm papa to 100 pencils. I bought the chair he sat in from a book of chairs, staplers, and spikes that let me play Vlad the Impaler with invading memos. When I said, I have to lay you off, a parallel universe was born in his face, one where flesh is a loose shirt taken to the river and beaten against rocks. Just by opening my mouth, I destroyed his faith he's a man who can think honey-glazed ham and act out the thought with plastic or bills. We sat. I stared at my hands. He stared at the wall, staring at my hands. I said other things about the excellent work he'd done and the cycles of business, which are like the roller coaster thoughts of an oscilloscope. All this time, I saw the eyes of his wife, which had always been brown like almonds, but were now brown like the crust of bread. We walked to the door. I shook his hand, felt the bones pretending to be strong. On his way home, there was a happy song because Deschades invented radio. The window was open. He saw delphinium, but couldn't remember the name. I can only guess. Maybe at each exit that could have led his body to Tempe, to Mars, he was tempted to forget his basketball team of sons, or that he ever liked helping his wife clean carrots, the silver sink turning orange. Running's natural to most animals who aren't part of a lecture series on nature's dead ends. When I told him, I saw he was looking for a place in his brain to hide his brain. I tried that later with beer. It worked until I stood at the toilet to make my little waterfall and thought of him pushing back from a bar to go make the same noise. So hopefully that helped with the following along of the narrative. Y una vez más en español, quizá, Paola, ¿gustarías leerlo en español esta vez? Cuando estés lista.
Todo seguido, ¿verdad, Luis?
Sí, todo enseguida.
Ok. Él tiene 5 hijos. Yo soy papá, de cientos de lápices. Compré la silla en que él se sentaba, de un libro de sillas, engrapadora y puntas, que me dejan jugar a Vlad el empalador, con menos invasores. Cuando le dije, tengo que despedir un universo paralelo, nació en su cara. Uno donde la piel es una camisa floja llevada al río y golpeada contra piedras. Con solo el abrir de mi boca destruí su confianza de ser hombre, que puede pensar en jamón glaciado en miel y vivir tal pensamiento con plástico o billetes. Sentábamos. Yo miraba mis manos, él miraba a la pared, mirando a mis manos. Le dije otras cosas, sobre el trabajo excelente que había hecho y los ciclos del negocio, que son como la montaña rusa de pensamientos de un osciloscopio. Todo el rato vi los ojos de su esposa, cuales siempre fueron café, como almendras, pero hoy fueron café como corteza de pan. Caminamos a la puerta, le di la mano, sentí sus huesos fingiendo ser fuertes. En camino a su casa tocaba una canción alegre, porque Said inventó la radio. La ventana estaba abierta. Él vio espuelas de caballero, pero no recordaba su nombre. Solo me imagino. Perdón. Quizá en cada salida te pudo llevar a su cuerpo, a Tempe o Marte. Estuvo tentado a olvidar su equipo de baloncesto de hijos o que le gustaba ayudar a su esposa para pelar zanahorias. La pila plateada volviéndose anaranjada. El huir es natural para la mayoría de los animales, cuales no son parte de una serie de charlas sobre los callejones sin salida de la naturaleza. Cuando le dije, vi que buscaba a un lugar en su mente para esconder a su mente, yo lo intenté después con cerveza. Trabajó hasta que me paré frente al inodoro a hacer mi cascadita y pensé en él retirándose de una barra para hacer el mismo ruido.
Excellent. Gracias, Paola. So, there's a lot of euphemisms that are happening within this poem to begin with. So, we should acknowledge that. Is everyone generally following the narrative of the poem now? Do we all see that this is, in fact, about a boss that feels remorse or regret about having to fire one of their employees?
I do.
Yeah. All right, I see some thumbs up there. It's good, good. Okay. So there's certain things where it's not a euphemism, ¿verdad? Los eufemismos aquí, hay varias cosas, por lo menos al empezar, que son directos, right? There's, he has 5 children. There's no real metaphor that we can use there, but, I'm papa to 100 pencils. That's at least a metaphor for saying that this is a person that is responsible for a ton of pencils, right? For people's work. We understand that there is a kind of power dynamic by, the speaker of the poem saying, I bought the chair he sat in from a book of chairs, staplers, and spikes that let me play Vlad the Impaler with invading memos. This maybe might not be 100% clear. I know that it took me a quick second after the very first time that I read it, that the spikes that he's talking about are those kinds of spikes where you would actually like press down and put either a receipt or, some sort of memo, as it says there, so that they don't fly away. It's all trash, but you still have it as a record of what you accomplished for the day. It's kind of like an old vintage sort of way of treating memos, but that's,
It looks like an ice pick upside down.
Right, exactly. It's like an ice pick that's upside down. So that's what that is referencing. Now here, that let me play Vlad the Impaler. You know, that right there is obviously a metaphor, right? It's a way of signaling to us that he is sticking paper through that spike. That's you know, one way in which a metaphor can function, right? And then pencils as people, that would also be, you know, as Abraham is pointing out in the chat, you know, I'm papa to 100 pencils. You know, the pencil would be a metaphor for employees. All right, so it's 100 employees that this person is responsible for. When I said, I have to lay you off, that right there, that is definitely a euphemism. I don't know about you, but I've been fired a couple of times in my life. And never have I been told directly by a supervisor that I was fired. I've almost always been told that I'm either laid off or that I am, you know, part of a, what do they call it? A when a
Downgrading.
reduction in the workforce, right?
Or I have to let you go.
I have to let you go. There's a reduction in the workforce. You know, you have to be laid off. I've never been told directly, you're fired. Never. Now, why is that? Well, it's to spare a person their feelings, right? So that's the first example of a poem that is about not using euphemisms where the euphemism is used. It's kind of ironic. Yeah, that is de-euphemism for sure. Now, everything after that then starts to become another form of a euphemism, right? It becomes all metaphor for the most part after this. You know, there's a flesh is a loose shirt taken to the river and beaten against rocks. I mean, this right here is a very striking image. I don't care who you are, you know, but the idea that loose skin is something that you take off and you just beat against the rock, that's probably closer to a dysphemism than, you know, than any other phrase in this particular poem. I mean, imagínense una ropa de piel que se está mutilando básicamente contra una piedra. I mean, that's a pretty shocking thing to.
Well, wouldn't it be something like a sagging face?
Yeah, his face becomes that. Right. So here, the speaker of the poem is now using metaphor to describe for us the condition of this person's face that is being fired. Right. It's a parallel universe where, you know, in his face, it's born where flesh is a loose shirt. Right. So it's just the way that I take that is that this person's face just completely withers and they're devastated to hear that they're laid off. Then continues on, right? Just by opening my mouth, I destroyed his faith. He's a man who can think honey glazed ham and act out the thought with plastic or bills. Now, what would we imagine that this is trying to tell us? Who can think honey glazed ham and act out the thought with plastic bills? What is honey glazed ham trying to symbolize for us? Either as
a sweet life.
The sweet life, right? You know, he's no longer a man who can think about the sweet life. Roots?
I take it like he can't indulge anymore. And he can't, or, you know, paper money is kind of what I feel.
The plastic, yeah. The plastic would be like a credit card.
Right. Right. How do we typically, you know, like for the majority of people, you know, we probably don't think plastic for a credit card, but you know, that could be considered perhaps a euphemism, right? It could be also a metaphor, right? Plastic is a metaphor for a credit card or any kind of, you know, physical card that you use to pay for things. So honey glazed ham as a metaphor or a euphemism, right? For the good life, for the sweet life, for being well off. You know, I don't know about you guys, but I've tried buying a honey glazed ham in the past, and they're expensive. The land of honey and milk, referring to prosperity. Yeah. So there we're already getting, you know, the use of both euphemism and metaphor, all to symbolize the good things, right? But then we get dysphemism in the sense of like the loose shirt as flesh, and the look on the man's face. Continue on, you know, gives us just directly, right? I stared at my hands. He stared at the wall, staring at my hands. I said other things about the excellent work he'd done and the cycles of business, which are like the roller coaster thoughts of an oscilloscope. So here, like the roller coaster thoughts of an oscilloscope, you know, just by using the word like, we get a simile as opposed to a metaphor. However, it's still a form of, you know, talking about an idea without directly calling it out. But why do you think it's important that the speaker of the poem tell us, I said other things about the excellent work he'd done? I mean, ¿qué importa en ese momento que le haya dicho, hiciste un trabajo buenísimo? What does that do for a person? It's not you, it's me.
Yeah,
That's a good way to put it, Abraham. Yeah.
it's
You know,
business. Yeah.
it's business, nothing personal.
Mm.
Para aliviar la culpa. Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, again, we find ways in which always to sugarcoat things when we feel bad about ourselves, right? What did Matthew Scully say earlier about our use of euphemism? It's that we feel a sense of hurt, right? The reason why we as individuals use euphemism is because we're trying to cover up some sense of, you know, guilt, some sense of wrongness, some sense of things not being morally the way that we want them to be, right? And then he goes on to talk about, you know, the wife whose eyes had always been brown like almonds, but now are the crust of bread, brown like the crust of bread. What's the difference between comparing someone's eyes to almonds to comparing them to crust of bread? What are those connotations that you get from that? What is the connotation of an almond to you in this phrase?
Right and cheerful.
Right? Cheerful.
No, I heard that expression before. Her eyes were like almonds,
Yeah.
but I can't
It's usually
remember
to
what
talk
it
about a
was.
person's shape, right? The shape of the eye.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
I
now
think
Yeah.
like
Eddie?
I think like almonds can be squeezed into almond milk. Like the metaphor of squeezing somebody else's soul out.
Yeah, maybe. If you get that, yeah. I mean, why not? Yeah. ¿Qué más? Abraham?
What I got from that one is that basically they're not gonna be able to buy bread, meaning his family is gonna have financial trouble to buy actually food.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, those comparisons, like almonds, I don't know how many of you buy almonds on a regular basis, but almonds are expensive. A small bag of almonds are very expensive. And
$78.
yeah, and that's just a small bag. I mean, we're not talking about like, you know, your larger big bag or big tub of almonds that you can get, you know, or that like peanuts, you know, you can get peanuts in really big boxes, big bags. But almonds, no, not at all, you know. Now, what is the connotation of a crust of bread in comparison to an almond?
Less expensive.
Less expensive.
You just the crust of just if I could just have the crust that falls from the table. I mean,
Mhm.
they're down in their luck.
Yeah. Abraham, it looked like you were saying something, but you're on mute. Did you have something to add? Crust also sounds like cost, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I think instead of sending messages to everybody, I'm sending to somebody. So I'm trying to figure out this chat.
Got it. Got it. But yeah, crust sounds like cost. So sure, there's that. The honor roll, it's not a luxury. Right? The crust of bread is not a luxury, not like almonds are. So, again, when you put two things and you compare them with each other, you're using the connotations of them to essentially describe something, right? Perhaps a euphemism for not being able to afford luxurious foods anymore, right? Just reinforcing the idea that this man no longer can buy honey glazed ham. Again, very directly, we walk to the door. I shake his hand. I feel the bones pretending to be strong. On his way home, there's a happy song, yada, yada, yada. So, now that's the speaker sort of imagining the rest of the day for the man that was just fired. He can only guess, he tells us, I should say. He imagines that the man might be tempted to just drive away and abandon his family and his wife, who he liked to help as they prepared dinner together. These are all things that the speaker of the poem is imagining. They're not actually happening. And then the speaker tells us, running's natural to most animals who aren't part of a lecture series on nature's dead ends. So this is now the speaker of the poem very directly saying something philosophical about this whole situation, that running is natural for most people, or sorry, not people, animals, right? But maybe not for humans, right? Maybe because humans feel a sense of responsibility to others. So that could be an allusion to that, right? I'm not familiar with Nature's Dead Ends in terms of whether it's a book or something like that, but that's generally the sense of what I get. Then we go back to the actual moment when the man is fired. When I told him, I saw he was looking for a place in his brain to hide his brain. So here, the speaker of the poem is reminding us that from his point of view, he could see the anguish in the man, right? But rather than saying he saw the anguish in the man who now lost his job, he's using euphemism to say that the man was looking for a place in his brain to hide his brain. In other words, looking for a place to retreat within himself, for a place to maybe forget about this terrible thing that is happening to them, right? That could be considered metaphor, that could be considered euphemism. Either way, we still get that same general idea. Then the speaker tells us that later, they tried it as well with beer, and it worked until they had to get up and go to the bathroom. But rather than saying having to get up and go pee, they say what? To make my little waterfall. Which one sounds worse? I have to go take a leak, I have to go piss, or I have to go make my little waterfall? Which is more vulgar? Well, for sure, this one is the euphemism, right? And then we finish off with just the reminder that the speaker of the poem, the poet, the boss, feels bad for having fired their employee. So it's kind of messed up to fire someone and on top of it, write a poem about it. Kind of cocky. I would agree with you, Carlos. I would agree. Like it's kind of a messed up thing. But if this is how you're going to cope with it, then I guess it's one way to cope, right? With something that is unfortunate, right? It's a euphemism. So, what are your thoughts now about the poem after having gone through it?
A lot clearer.
It's a lot clearer. Excellent. Any other general observations that anyone has? Yeah. All right.
I like,
Mr.
oh, excuse me.
I like the images about this, and he has a heart that he cares, but what can he do? His hands are tied, I guess.
Yeah. To a certain degree, yeah. Abraham says in the chat he actually cares because he is the father of 100. Right. So he sees himself as the father of 100 pencils, right? 100 employees. So Miss Luz, your turn.
I remember that my dad, he used to dream a lot about being unemployed and about getting fired. And he said it was a recurring like nightmare. And I've always felt that from him, that being employed and being the provider of his family is the first and foremost important thing of his life. And that the times that he was fired were like so devastating and traumatic because he couldn't provide for us. So this poem is really pretty heart-wrenching because the person who has to do that is really acknowledging that, because he's not just doing it, you know, automatically. It's part of his job. He's really feeling it. So I wouldn't want to be him, because obviously he has a conscience and he has to do this because he has to keep his job.
Right.
So he's totally in the other guy's, trying to be in his feet, obviously not wearing his shoes, not being in his shoes, but he is definitely acknowledging what it's like to be on the receiving end of being let go.
Yeah, definitely.
So
yeah.
it's very powerful, very
yeah.
powerful piece.
Yeah, and I think that is definitely, you know, one of the reasons why this poem exists too, is because the poet, it is feeling it, even if the poet wasn't the one actually doing this and is only using persona. You know, the speaker of the poem is for sure feeling it. So yeah. Gia?
Thank you for sharing this one.
Yeah, absolutely. Gia?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's a dichotomy of emotions, because the author knows that as bad as they are feeling, they're not feeling worse than the person that got fired. So there's this sort of weird thing like, oh, I feel bad, but you know, I still not as worse off as this other person, you know?
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting that it plays with that a little bit.
But at the end of the day, they both have to stand in front of a toilet and make a cascade. So I think regardless of who's doing the firing, they're equals, and he's acknowledging that.
Yeah.
Well,
That's
the overall thing to me, at my own personal observation, is that the poet is struggling. Believe it or not, this is what I see. Trying to be right in the third person, he gets involved.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the speaker of the poem is definitely involved, right? They are the one experiencing all of the emotion and everything. And as a person that has had to also fire people in the past, through jobs that I've had in the past, it is difficult, especially when you know the person and their circumstances. Like obviously the speaker of the poem here, you know, they know that the person that they're firing has 5 kids and a wife to support. So, you know, there's definitely conflict for sure in this. And it's also kind of messed up in its own way to write about this experience. But I mean, the poet is going to have to cope with it in some form or another, you know, if the poet is in fact the one that did the firing, because we can only assume, you know. So, you know, there's a lot of things that are happening here, you know, that I think speak to why we create euphemisms, why we have these sort of internal conflicts that sometimes are used to manipulate other people into feeling a certain way about certain subjects. I mean, it's not often that you will find people who talk about the experience of firing an employee in a very positive way, you know. And if we think about, you know, the ways in which like that can be then, used or manipulated or weaponized to, push another ideology in the way that, like, say, politics are often, using euphemisms and these emotional conflicts, internal conflicts that we all experience. It starts to really, I think, at least for me as a poet, dawn on me that my words are very powerful, especially if I understand the importance of a connotation and a euphemism when, trying to describe things that are hard to describe or that are just difficult to talk about. No one likes to talk about death. No one really likes to talk about religion in a way that's critical or in a way that is honest with themselves about some of the, things that are exclusionary or whatever. And like, those are things that are hard for people to acknowledge in a lot of different ways. And it's especially true for, the current political climate where those things are all being fused together into an ideology that is exclusionary. So, and that's equal for both sides. That's not necessarily the case for just conservatives. That's also the same for, people that are on the opposite end of that.
So it was, to me, it was a great writing, and I saw him as the how you say, narrator, telling about an employer getting rid of an employee. And so, I mean, it was a great writing. And then he put what he saw, he wrote what he saw the employer feelings about the employee on what he had to do. I mean, it was, like I say, it's like three people. And he did a great job. It was a great writing.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, Miss Lois. So I was hoping to be able to do this as part of our session today. Our conversation, I think, was a very good one, and I'm glad that all of you contributed. So here is what is going to happen for this week's writing prompt. This week, I'd like you all to develop your own list of euphemisms for different socially uncomfortable situations. So like I was mentioning earlier, it could be things that are like religious in nature, political in nature, things that you might have difficulty feeling comfortable talking about because you feel like it might, ostracize you in some form or another, which that in itself is a form of censorship. Remember, our theme this time around is censors, right? And no one is a worse censor than ourselves in a lot of cases, because we just feel like we can't be completely honest. So create a list of euphemisms for different socially uncomfortable situations. Then develop a list of euphemisms for moments or ideas that are too taboo to be spoken about openly. All right, this might be, a particular view on the use of, like, say, the Latinx label, right? And how it's evolved over time to be from Latino, Latina to Latinx to now Latine with an E at the end. Those things are very problematic in our community. And, that could be something that you might find difficult to talk about in an open way based on your viewpoint. So create a list of euphemisms that might speak to that moment or idea in particular. And then write a poem that expands on all of those euphemisms. Think about how in the poem that we just read, it was about a man firing someone and them having to deal with the guilt using euphemisms in a lot of different ways to cover that guilt, right? So write a poem that really expands on these euphemisms, uses them, plays with them, maybe turns them on their head, uses dysphemisms instead. But definitely consider your connotations and the metaphors that you use. And that will be your writing assignment for this week. Any questions?
Will they be going into the book?
Yes.
Oh, no, we can't do that.
Well, I mean, if you choose, of course.
No, because
Only
what
if
I
you
have going
choose.
on in my head, what I would like to discuss, I'm not afraid to or shame to discuss anything, and I don't try to embarrass anyone. I like for them to open up because I, worked in the outreach,
Mhm.
and there's just things that with young people. I was a youth minister, and so I discuss things with them and ask them why they chose that lifestyle, and so it had nothing to do with religion. I want to know if you're capable of going one way that you were made to go.
Mhm.
Why is it that you're going another way that's opposite of what I don't say that to them. I'm just saying that to you so it can be clean.
Yeah.
And so so
Notice your use of euphemism to
yeah,
talk about.
so it's interesting.
Yeah.
Why do we call an orange an orange? I mean, it's simple as that to me to discuss those kind of things without trying to insult. And I just want to know. I
Well,
just
yeah.
I just want to know. That's all it is,
Yeah.
And so
And
so I'm not ashamed to discuss anything because I had young people on my street, and one girl, she told me, she says, that's before I got married. She says, Miss Jackson, she says, you never talk about me. You take me just as I am. Well,
Mhm.
that's you. It has something to do with me,
Mhm.
So I don't
Yeah.
criticize. I don't do that.
Yeah.
That's your lifestyle. That's you. But I just want to know, I'm just nosy.
Well, I think that what you're ultimately trying to say, or at least this is what I'm understanding, is that you're just more curious and you're seeking understanding. And so, that I think is really, when it comes down to it, the most important thing that we can do as people is that we need to seek understanding so that we can empathize, so that we can feel what the other person is feeling, and then work together, right? To
But the thing of
overcome
it is,
whatever things make us feel uncomfortable.
it's going on since the beginning of time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so we have nothing to do. That's between them and
Mhm.
their God,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it has nothing to do with me, but I'm just curious.
Yeah. I think it's very, very, valid to have questions, to, again, seek understanding. And, it's like Abraham is saying in the chat, write it down. Don't allow these things to be bottled up, because they just get worse if you don't acknowledge them. And you do not have to publish them. You don't even have to turn it in for this week if it makes you uncomfortable, that uncomfortable, but write it down.
Oh, I'm not
Acknowledge the fact
uncomfortable.
that these things are residing in your head, and use this maybe as an opportunity to better understand yourself and why you feel a need to hide these things.
Oh no,
Why you
I
feel a
don't.
need.
I'm just saying that if it was going to
Well,
be
no.
put in the book, I would like for it to be put in a decent way.
Yeah.
No, not from
Yeah.
when people pick up our books, we want everybody to feel comfortable in reading them.
Absolutely.
That's why we put them out. So so somebody that's picking it up might be in that lifestyle, and then they get upset, and we don't want nobody upset.
Right. Yeah. And, I think it's also important for me to also say, any work that is, overtly prejudiced, discriminatory, based on age, race, sex, gender, sexual orientation, all of that, that's the work that we will not publish, just to be very clear. But that said, if those are things that are making, you as a writer feel uncomfortable, and you're using euphemisms, acknowledge that you're using euphemisms to discuss those things, and, use it again as an opportunity to maybe really self-reflect on why you feel you have to use euphemisms. What is it that you're afraid of? What is it that maybe you can do to generate the understanding that you're really seeking to have, right? And how can we openly discuss things without getting angry at each other? I think that's always a really good thing for us to consider. So this particular week's assignment might be challenging, but don't feel like you have to hold back, because like I said, our theme is censorship and censors, right? We ourselves are censors. We're always self-censoring by using euphemism, by using words with particular connotations. When a person nowadays says something about, a boomer in reference to a person's age, the time in which they were born, and they use it in a derogatory way, right? That's a connotation that has developed recently, and it's a way to hide the fact that there is judgment about a person's age and about their ideologies without fully understanding where those things are coming from, right? That's what I mean by it's not just one side that uses coded language, that uses euphemisms and dysphemisms and takes advantage of the connotations in which, in the ways in which things are said. So more than anything, I hope that's what you start to consider as you work on your writing for this week. All right. So yeah, radicalizing is another concept at play there, especially when it comes to politics. So, all right, that being said, thank you, everyone. Thank you to those who were joining in through the live stream. And, if anybody has any kind of questions, feel free to reach out. You can always find our handouts and things like that on Google Classroom if you fully enroll, which you can find that information at dstilarts.org. And also, for anybody that is just ready to submit something, you can always go directly to our website, dstilarts.org/conchasticafezin. You can find the link to submit your work now if you're ready to go. So thanks again, everyone. And, I'll stick around for a couple minutes here if anybody has any specific questions about today, about this week's assignment. But for now, we will, stop sharing the screen, and the live stream is